Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Great to have you all with us. My name is Casey Alvey. I work as a senior outreach coordinator with New York City Parks GreenThumb, and we're really excited to have Aleah Butler Jones from Cornell University for part 2 of our series on managing weeds in the garden. And we'll be using the chat for all Q&A, so please add your questions there throughout Aleah's talk, and we'll keep track of them until she's ready for questions. And again, you're welcome to put your name, where you're coming from, whether you're part of a community garden, and your pronouns in the chat. So glad you all can join us. So for now, I'm going to pass it to Aleah, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end.
Thank you so much, Casey. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. Okay, so I'm Aleah Butler Jones. I work in the Gao-Nissen Lab at Cornell University in the horticulture section of the School of Integrated Plant Science. I know there's a lot of organizations within organizations, but just to have an idea of y'all have my affiliation. So I'm going to share my screen, and we want to do this screen, share that. Everyone can see that. And I want, okay, and do you see a managing weeds in the garden and a blue screen, and you do not see presenter view? Perfect. Just want to make sure. That would be a little embarrassing. Okay, so thank you for joining this webinar. We're going to talk about managing weeds in the garden. Like Casey said, this is part 2. In the previous one, we talked more so about weed identification and touched a little bit on managing weeds in the garden. And so in this presentation, we're going to talk about weed identification a little bit more, just mainly as a refresher, and then also giving you the chance to practice these skills. And then we're going to spend a good chunk of this presentation talking about control options and management options suited to the small site community garden and also personal garden setting. So if you were in the first presentation, then you probably have an idea that I like polls and participation. So to start, we're going to have a poll question, and I'm asking this so that we can get an idea of your experience with weed identification and management. So if you feel like you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced, whatever, all are welcome here. And so we're going to start with that, and we are going to, the polls are not showing up I have it right here. So starting with that poll is launching. And so just take a couple of minutes to fill it out. And once everyone comes in, then we will share those poll results with everyone. Okay, so far 6 of the 9 people have participated. So we'll wait another 30 seconds or so to let others fill out that poll if they so desire. There's no requirement that you do. It will just help inform how I approach these things. Okay, just 2 left. We'll give it another about 20 seconds. Okay, another 5. Okay, I'll close the poll here. And can everyone see the results? There we go. Can everyone see the results now? Wonderful. Okay, so we have quite a few people who feel like they have a nominal beginner level knowledge of weed identification and management. A couple of people who feel sort of confident about their skills. That's great to see. And That's great if you're a beginner, if you're intermediate, all of these things are perfectly fine. And I hope to help you move along your weed identification and management journey, and answer any questions you have at the end. So in this presentation, we're going to go over these 5 areas really. We'll start with discussing what exactly is a weed. We'll do a brief review of weed identification, but most of that time will be spent on doing an identification activity. So we'll send you into small breakout groups, and I'll explain more when that comes up. Then we will move into discussing control options targeted towards a garden and community garden and small site area. Finally, we'll speak briefly about a few uses for weeds. So weeds are not all bad, they're just plants. And so some things that you can do with common garden weeds that you find. And then finally, we'll do a brief recap. So moving on. So the way that we will start is we'll start with discussing what is a weed. So in this presentation, there will be a total of 2 breakout rooms, and this is the first one. And in this, I asked you to sort of think about this question: what exactly is a weed? It's a question that's pretty key to manage identification, like why bother identifying something if you are not sure if it's a weed, and how do you control something if you're not even sure what a weed is? So we'll have about 6 minutes to discuss in your breakout rooms what do you think is a weed, and it's the judgment free, just give your thoughts, and then we'll come back in the greater group and share a few of our thoughts. So we'll take like 3 to 5 answers. So as Nolani talked about, it's very subjective. What is a weed? What isn't a weed is extremely subjective designation. It's very situation dependent. You put in noxious plant into Google and you'll get many different definitions. I have dictionary.com over on the left here, and it's saying a valueless plant growing wild, especially one that grows on cultivated ground to the exclusion or injury of a desired crop. And then Merriam-Webster, their first definition is a plant that is not valued where it is growing is usually of vigorous growth. So we see crops come up consistently, value the inherent value of the plant. It's not valued where it is situationally. So to put it quite simply, a weed is a plant out of place, and it can be out of place spatially, like you see on the right. It's similar to the situation I described earlier of your tall fescue lawn, but then if you have tall fescue plants growing between your pavers or on the sidewalk or in a gravel pathway, you might call this a weed, but it can also be a weed growing out of place in time. So for example, let's say you have a garden bed, raised bed, and you grew tomatoes there one year. And then the next year you planted with cabbage. And when you're planting, you notice that a couple little tomato plants have come up. Well, nothing has changed inherently about the tomato plant, but some may consider that a weed because it does not fit within the majority of the desired cabbage growing environment. So moving on from that, what is weed ID and why is it important? So weed ID is, put very simply, it's the process of identifying weeds. You probably got that from the name weed ID or weed identification. It's in the name. And then the next question is, okay, well, why bother with weed identification? Well, first things first, it's fun. I like it. I'm pretty much have taken a year minimum of coursework on just weeds and their identification. But for non-weed scientist-esque people, it's useful to pretty much anyone working in any type of natural system, garden, forest, whatever. First things first, it's helpful to know thy enemy. Not to say that weeds are an enemy in any particular way. They are not dangerous to us, except in certain cases. But in the sense of if you are a gardener, or you're an urban farmer, or you're a community gardener, these are outside of your desired plants. And know your enemy sort of leads into, it allows for the selection of appropriate control methods. So by understanding, first being able to identify a weed, then you can look into its biology, or you know information about its biology and reproduction, which then allows you to select appropriate control or management options. So this can include optimal timing of intervention. So let's say you might have hairy gallinsoga in your garden. Hairy gallinsoga is a weed that can have 3 to 5 generations in upstate New York, where our growing seasons are relatively short. So if you know that about hairy gallinsoga and you see it in your field, well, now you can see, okay, has it gone to seed already, or has it not gone to seed already? Because if it hasn't even gone to seed, and even if it has gone to seed already, it can repeatedly go to seed. So it still might be worthwhile to remove the weed and basically intervene in that system. Another thing is knowing about potential vegetative reproductive structure. So let's say you have quackgrass in your yard or in your garden. Well, you know it's a grass, and usually you're like, okay, the soil's moist, I can just pull it out. But knowing that if you identified it, you would know that it has rhizomes. So you would know that when you pull it out, then you should also take some time to take a cobra head weeder, which I will discuss later, and dig some of those rhizomes out, because otherwise you can just pull the tops off, but quackgrass will still resprout from those vegetative structures. You wouldn't know this if you didn't know what the weed was from the very beginning. And then finally, the impact of the weed. If you know what the weed is, then you are better informed to make the decision of, is control actually needed? Now, this can be a safety issue, as we see, we have the example of Virginia creeper on the left and poison ivy on the right. And I have a feeling if you're in a community garden, you probably want to reduce the amount of poison ivy present, especially if kids are around and things of such. It can be quite nasty. However, looking at these two plants, they look relatively similar. So you might have a lot of Virginia creeper in your area, which can be pretty and it's nice ground cover, but you might think it's poison ivy and spend the time, resources, and energy to pull that when you actually didn't even need to do that, or vice versa. You might think you have Virginia creeper or some other nice looking plant, but it's actually poison ivy, and then someone might be injured. So that's a safety standpoint. Another option is like the plant might be a pollinator attractant, and you might think like, oh, I don't necessarily want to remove this plant because it will bring beneficials to my garden, or it might be a native plant. Basically, you can't necessarily make these decisions if you're not informed of this information. Okay, I hope everyone's keeping along with me. So I'm not going to go over the basics, most of the basics of identification and like the botany, because that was covered more extensively in the part 1. However, I will review briefly the information regarding grasses and grass-like plants, because you will next have a weed ID activity, and this will be relevant to you to be able to identify these weeds. So to keep it simply, I know this is a lot of information on there, but we're just going to go through it together. The main point on this that you need to understand is the sheath, vernation, ligule, and auricles. So starting with the sheath, if you can see my cursor, the sheath is this area of the grass. And the sheath is the lower part of the leaf that surrounds the stem and younger leaves of grasses. And that's important because many of these other terms are in relation to the sheath. So for example, vernation is the shape of the leaves as they expand from the sheath. This is only relevant to monocots. I am purposely using the word monocot instead of grasses because not all monocots are grasses. And they're generally described as rolled, as you can see here, folded. And then there's also a third option called triangular. Keep that in mind, it will be relevant. Third is the ligule, and ligule you can't really see it in this image on over here, but here are zoomed in drawings of ligules. They are small outgrowths found at the base of a leaf blade on monocots. It's not present on all monocots and is generally described as membranous, hairy, and absent. And then finally, auricles. They're small projections of tissues found at the base of monocot leaf blades, which surrounds the sheath. So in this image, you can see it very small here. Again, it's not present on all monocots and is generally described as claw-like or long or clasping. So they go like this. Short or stubby, so they're more like this, and absent. So don't worry about memorizing this stuff. It was provided, it's on a PDF, and that you can access at any time. And it's also described in field guides and things as such. So now we're going to move into our second activity, which is a weed identification activity. So I'm going to send you to breakout rooms again. You probably won't be in the same breakout rooms, they're random. And you'll have about 12 minutes. That will be when you get a warning, 60-second warning. So technically you have 13 minutes to identify these 4 weeds below. It's not a test, don't worry. We're gonna go over the answers and how I would approach identifying them at the end. And you were provided a PDF document. It has pictures and more pictures and information about each of these weeds. So I recommend looking at that. And then if you want something that's helpful is using the Cornell Turfgrass and Landscape ID website. If you want, we'll post the link to that in the chat so you'll have access to it. And then once everyone comes back, you will get the answers. Don't worry, it's not going to be the type of presentation where you go home and you're just going to be wondering, because I find that annoying myself. So going forward, this is the Cornell Weed ID website. That's what we're going to use for this. And I will send you to your breakout rooms now. Here are the answers. So yes, plant C is absolutely lamb's quarters. Great answer. If you look at the reference document, you can see that it has these dentate or toothed leaves. It has this sort of triangular shape. Chenopodium means goose foot, so it's sort of similar to the foot of a goose. And it also has this very distinctive sort of like whitish powdery texture. Lamb's quarters, it's very common in gardens. It's very common everywhere. All the way to the left, that is common ragweed. One of the groups before said mugwort. I pulled up where I was looking down and I was looking in my copy of Weeds of the Northeast, and I was looking at mugwort again. I'm like, oh yeah, no, I could see that. But no, this is common this is common ragweed, Ambrosia artemisifolia. Again, very common in gardens and disturbed sites. It has these very deeply lobed leaves, almost similar to carrots, but different. If you have hay fever or you get allergies a lot and you're thinking it's goldenrod, for most people, it's actually common ragweed that's causing that itchiness and hay fever symptoms. Plant B is barnyard grass, so Echinocloa crustali. So in the document, you'll see that it has a rolled vernation. And then the things that are very unique about barnyard grass is that it both lacks auricles and ligules. And that's very, very specific to barnyard grass. Again, very common in gardens, very common in agricultural settings. And then finally, this is the tricky one that I hinted at earlier, talking about the triangular vernation. This is yellow nut sedge. So technically, it is not a grass, it is a sedge. And it grows from tubers, from nutlets. And it also produces rhizomes, but it overwinters in these nutlets. They look like, if you've ever seen some bulbs, like a very mini version of that, it's about probably the size of a dime. So I won't torture you anymore, and we'll move on to the stuff that you guys really wanted to hear about, which is control options. So For control options, these are going to target a garden, community garden, urban farm setting, and we're going to mainly talk about cultural control practices, preventative control practices, mechanical control practices, and briefly chemical control practices, very briefly. A lot of this information is available at the Cornell University Turfgrass and Landscape Weed ID tool. This is the control option page on there. So if you don't remember or want to learn more about some of these options and tools I mentioned, you're free to go there. Other extension offices have very good information about control options for the garden setting. This is targeting landscapes, but still relevant. So we'll start with preventative control. Preventative control encompasses any method that strives to prevent the introduction and establishment of weeds in an area or crop. So in a garden setting, it can include making sure you don't apply mulch that's contaminated by weed seed, tubers, or nutlets, such as, so here, this is probably rye straw mulch. So hopefully this was harvested before the rye went to seed, because otherwise you're gonna get a lot of volunteer rye weeds. In addition, I recommend talking to your vendor and asking, where did this mulch come from? Is it weed free? Did the materials go to seed before it was harvested? These are all questions that you can ask that can help you reduce the amount of weed introductions to your garden or community garden. Another common preventative strategy that is applicable across a range of scales, from a little community garden, personal garden, to a medium-sized community garden, to a full-size 100-acre vegetable farm. It's cleaning your equipment before moving from one area to another. So in this picture, we have some muddy boots, and if soil's stuck in the treads, it can be brushing that off or scraping it out, because weed seeds can stay in that and then introduce things to new areas. And then finally, making sure that you don't trying to minimize the number of weeds you allow to go to seed, or set seed is another way of saying it. And then if it has gone to seed, making sure that, if it has already set seed, making sure you don't compost those weeds. I recommend limiting, this can be also done by limiting, new weeds can be limited, their introduction can be limited from outside sources by maintaining borders, by not importing weed contaminated soil, not importing weed contaminated mulches, and also only applying properly in well composted manure. Because if it's not properly composted, if it doesn't reach a certain temperature for long enough, then you can have weeds that will still germinate. Moving on, next is cultural control options, which is any method that involves altering the growing environment to reduce weed pressure and improve crop competitiveness. So this can be done through crop rotation, as we see on the left, mulching, as we see in the middle. This is from in my backyard at home, and we have a raised bed, and we have some wood chip, we have mulch on top of that, and also cover cropping, which you might think cover cropping as in what larger farms do, but gardeners can cover crop as well. So with cultural control, what you're trying to do is make your crop as competitive as possible. And the reason why you're doing this is because weeds are often more competitive than cultivated plants. And in a landscape setting, even though that they don't really have much of an advantage in turf, they can become more competitive with proper fertilization timing, but also in landscapes and gardens, proper fertilization timing can also improve the competitiveness of your crop. So we're going to talk about in more depth mulching and cover crops, but right now I'll talk briefly about crop rotation. I have a feeling that a lot of you are familiar with it, but if you're not familiar with the term or the phrase crop rotation is a process of moving your crop across growing season. So in this garden, you see we have 6 beds, And in 1 year, someone's growing in this bed, it appears to be cabbage, and in the next bed, it appears to be strawberries. I mean, in the next bed, we have strawberries. So next year, ideally, this person would not grow cabbage in this bed or any brassica to be actually ideally even better. They would grow maybe tomatoes in here or eggplant, or maybe they'll grow strawberries, or they'll grow something else, something in a different plant family. And in this bed, they will not grow strawberries. They'll grow something maybe in the Asteraceae family. So maybe they'll grow lettuce, or maybe they'll grow sunflowers, or maybe they'll grow something in the Solanaceae. So maybe they'll grow peppers in this bed. So the point of this is to move it around, not only to reduce weed pressure, but also to reduce disease pressure, try to balance nutrient uptake. So crop rotation is relevant for multiple reasons. I do this in my gardeners. Every farm, most farmers I've talked to do crop rotation as well. Moving on, we're going to talk about weed barriers. So also called mulching, but I use weed barriers because not everything, if you're putting down plastic, is it a mulch? Some people might not consider plastic mulch. So weed barriers. So also mulching, it's the application of material to the soil to act as a surface covering. So weeds tend to grow where bare soil and water are available. And the way that mulches work is they would prevent and limit the amount of sunlight from reaching the soil surface. Most of the weeds in your garden that are going to germinate and establish are ones within like the top 2 inches of the soil profile. And if you're dealing in a raised bed, your raised bed probably isn't deeper than 10 to 12 inches, and that's quite deep for a raised bed. So by covering the soil surface, you're limiting the light which is required for the germination of many weeds. And it's also required for the growth of all chlorophytic or green plants. So on the left side of this page, you see these are some examples of organic mulches. I don't mean organic in the sense of food production. I mean organic meaning something derived from natural material. So we have on the top, we have wood chips. In the middle, we have dry straw mulch, and then on the bottom we have newspaper. Newspaper can work as a mulch. On the right, we have some inorganic mulches. So we have gravel, landscape fabric, and black plastic mulch. So organic mulches, as I said before, they are any naturally derived material. They tend to decompose freely over time. As they decompose, they add organic matter to the soil. But because they decompose, they have to be reapplied every 2 to 3 years. Coarser materials generally provide better weed control because they dry faster after any irrigation event, and they exclude more light. And then in regards to paper mulches also break down over time and can be incorporated into the soil. However, unlike other organic mulches, they're applied at a much shallower depth. So instead of applying 2 to 3 inches of mulch, you would apply maybe a few sheets of newspaper and then cover it with other mulch. In regards to organic mulches, you want to reapply every 2 to 3 years, like I said before, to compensate for settling due to decomposition, and maintain a mulch layer of about 2 to 3 inches. And organic mulches have offer many benefits to your garden. They improve soil quality and structure as they decompose. They limit mulches in general, limit soil erosion, reduce water loss. They help moderate soil temperature. So they tend to, like if you have your heat wave, the temperature of the soil tends not to spike nearly as much. And then also it provides good winter protection if you need that. Inorganic mulches, they're mostly used as a barrier to weeds. So they don't have to be man-made products such as landscape fabric or plastic mulches. Gravel can be used as an inorganic mulch. You've probably seen it in some landscape areas, they use a bit of gravel mulch. And so landscape fabric is the most common one used in gardens. And those and other geotextiles are more expensive and time consuming to install than organic mulches. And then also when replacing old landscape fabric, which you will have to do as it degrades and breaks apart, it's typically a bit more difficult to replace once it's in an existing planting. So I tend not to really like landscape fabric in a garden setting, especially if you can put down straw mulch or something else. And also they have other disadvantages, such as they tend to be effective for a shorter amount of time. They're not as effective controlling perennial weeds. And then also, as those weeds pop through the fabric, which is pretty common for perennial weeds, so think like your Canada thistles and also some biennial weeds such as bull thistle, they can be sort of hard to pull out, remove from the landscape fabric because it's sort of like woven in there. And then also landscape fabric can be easy to catch on tools. So like if you're scuffle hoeing or trying to pull things out, we actually in my home garden, we have some raspberry canes in a raised bed, and they were planted through landscape fabric. And now we have to somehow figure out to undo the raspberry canes from all this landscape fabric to weed beneath it. It helped and it kept things pretty clean for a year, but now things are popping through again. So does that make sense to everyone about these mulches and weed barriers? Okay. So moving on, we're going to talk about the stale seedbed technique. This is a great technique, again, used in small settings. It's relevant to gardens, small gardens, all the way to larger production farms. So in the stale seedbed technique, what you're doing is you're stimulating germination of weeds in the top 1 to 2 inches of your soil profile. Again, like I said before, most of the weeds that are going to be a problem in your garden are going to be in that top 1 to 2 inches of soil. And then you do this before you plant, so it allows you to kill these weeds before you even plant. So the way that you would do this is you would prepare your seed beds for planting as normal. So if you cultivate, you would cultivate the soil, you could firm it down, pack it down, or step on it a bit to help pack it down, water it, which can help. And you will leave it undisturbed for a couple of weeks and allow weeds to germinate and come up. Like I said, you can water to hasten germination, and you want to allow these weeds to grow to about the white thread stage. So that means when you pull it out, the root looks like a little white thread. The reason why you want to leave this to allow it to grow to this stage is because when it's uprooted, when it's this small, it desiccates much more easily than it would if it was a large plant. If you leave it to like the first true leaf stage or second true leaf stage, that's also good too. You just don't want to allow the weeds to get very big, because then it's very easy for them to reestablish, unless you actually like pull the weed and then pick it up and remove it from the site. And then this process, once you allow the weeds to germinate, then you cultivate to uproot these weeds. So this can be done with a scuffle hoe. This can be done by hand. I wouldn't do it by hand because it's a lot of little weeds. So I would use a scuffle hoe, or a rake will also work. And then you can repeat this process as many times as you want. So oftentimes, if you do this once or twice, you're pretty much good. And this will greatly decrease the amount of weeds in that top 1 to 2 inch of the soil profile, which should reduce the weed pressure in the season. So your second flush will not be as strong, as robust as your first flush. For tips for success, again, do not allow these weeds to grow large, because it will be very difficult to remove, and the chance of it reestablishing will be that much higher. Germination loves moisture, so I really recommend watering it instead of just leaving it. If it's particularly dry, many of the weed seeds probably will not germinate, and then you've sort of done this for nothing. And then final tip is keep your cultivation pretty shallow. You don't have to dig in there with a traditional hoe and dig divots. You don't have to get in there with the shovel. If you skim like the top inch, that will kill a good chunk of them. And again, if they're small, you don't even have to remove them. If you leave them on the surface, the sun will dry them out and they will not be viable. So this is a really good process. I've seen it used. It's pretty useful. I like the Seedbed technique, and it's relevant to a ton of different sizes in gardens. Moving on, we're going to talk about cover cropping. You've probably heard about cover cropping, especially for larger production systems, but cover crops are definitely useful to small production systems or community gardens or personal gardens in addition. So a cover crop is pretty much a crop that is established between the harvest of the main crop and the sowing of the next main crop. And they're established they're sown to avoid bare soil between two main crops, and they also provide multiple services. So some of these services include reducing soil erosion and runoff, reducing soil crusting. So if you've ever noticed when you're walking around in the soil after a rain event, it gets like this thick crust where it's sort of hard to penetrate. Cover crops can help reduce that. It can also help improve soil structure and stability by increasing aggregation, relevant to why y'all are here, reducing weed pressure. Again, it can sort of act as a living mulch, and then increase soil organic matter. So when you're using cover crops, you want to plant early enough that they have at least 4 weeks of growth before they are killed by the winter, assuming they are not winter hardy. You do not want to allow cover crops to go to seed because it sort of defeats the purpose. If you allow a cover crop such as rye, for example, something that's pretty winter hardy to go to seed, don't be very surprised if you have some rye volunteer crops in your next season, which again doesn't completely defeat the purpose, but if you're trying to reduce weed pressure, you sort of added some weed seeds. And then finally, when you turn your cover crop under, when you incorporate your cover crop, you want to do it at least 3 weeks before you plant the area. You do not want to turn your cover crop under and then on Monday and then on Friday plant your crop. Don't do that. It's not going to grow as well. Give it some time to break down into your soil. So we're going to go over a few cover crops that are useful, that are appropriate for garden settings. These can be readily accessed online at many stores sell these cover crops. So we'll start with annual ryegrass. That is planted between rows on the right side of the slide. And it is sown in early spring through late summer. And it's a very good nurse crop. A nurse crop is a crop that you use to help other cover crops that are not as quick to establish more quickly. So it crowds out the weeds, so it leaves an area for other less quickly establishing weeds to come up. So some of the legumes are slower to establish than rye or oats, for example. It's a really good nurse crop. It is very good about soil cover, reducing erosion, and improving soil aggregation. And a good thing about annual rye, if you ever drive up to Geneva or drive up around Ithaca, you'll see a lot of fields planted with this stuff that looks sort of like wheat, but it's more blue-green, and you'll see it in early spring and late fall. That is annual ryegrass. And the thing that's very good about it is that it's very hardy. So even in these harsh upstate New York winters and milder New York City winters, the annual ryegrass will survive over the winter. So it provides good winter cover. Next plant we're going to talk about is buckwheat. That is down here. If you've ever had a buckwheat pancake, they're using the grain from this. Buckwheat is sown in the summer, so it's sown in June to July. And you might think to yourself, well, how is that going to give enough time for it to grow adequately before it's killed? It is winter killed. Buckwheat grows very quickly. It is very good about covering the ground more quickly than annual ryegrass or oats, though you should know that buckwheat is susceptible to flooding. So if your garden area or your raised bed is prone to flooding, if buckwheat is exposed to flooding, it will stop growing. And buckwheat tends to get about 3 feet tall. It has these beautiful flowers that attract pollinators. It's a great plant. And then finally, oats. In the top left corner of the picture, you'll see oats, avena, sativa, if you've ever used Aveeno lotion, avena, Aveeno, oats. Those are sown either in April, so they're sown in the spring, or they're sown in the late summer from mid-August to September. And like buckwheat and annual ryegrass, it tends to grow relatively quickly, so it tends to be a pretty good nurse crop like annual ryegrass. It improves soil aggregation, but you might be thinking, why would I use oats versus rye? Well, there's a few reasons. One, oats incorporate into the soil and break down more quickly than rye does. So if that's something that you're concerned about, I would go with oats. However, if you're looking for something that will give you winter cover, I would go with rye, because oats tend not to be, at least in upstate New York, they're not winter hardy, and downstate New York, it's not reliably hardy. So if that's something that's the priority you're trying to go toward, that's your priority, I would not go with oats. So it really depends. There's a cover crop for any type of thing you need. So moving on, we're going to talk about two leguminous cover crops that are appropriate for the garden and can easily be acquired. Hairy vetch and red clover. These are sometimes sold in cover crop mixes. So it might be like red clover and oats in a mix together that people plant. And so starting with hairy vetch, that is the top one here. It has these blue flowers and compound pinnate leaves. That is sown in late August to September. They can be slow to establish, so it can be helpful to use a nurse crop such as oats or rye. You really want to make sure that vetch does not go to seed, because it can be quite weedy. It is not reliably hardy. And the good thing about vetch and both red clover is it fixes nitrogen. So if you have your hairy vetch in your garden and you allow it to put your one bed out of rotation and you grow vetch in it, in about a year, you'll get 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So of course that would have to be scaled down to the square footage of your garden, but that is something that it provides back to the soil. And then finally, the last cover crop I will discuss today is red clover. It's at the bottom, Trifolium pretense. That is sown either in the spring from February to March, or starting again in late spring, April, all the way into September. It is somewhat hardy. It's more hardy than hairy vetch, but it's not as hardy as annual rye. It is not drought tolerant, so that is something that if that is common in your area, I wouldn't necessarily recommend using red clover. And like hairy vetch, it fixes nitrogen to your soil. It fixes a higher rate of nitrogen, 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. Again, you would have to scale that down to your garden bed, which is good, because I don't think it's not a good idea to dump 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen in a 4x4 bed. So that is the extent that we're going to talk about cover crops and control and cultural control, and we'll move into physical/mechanical control. Physical control / mechanical control, of course, is any method that limits unwanted plant growth through physical means. So this can be hand weeding on the left, these can be hand tools, or string trimming, like around garden beds can be helpful if you can't necessarily pull it up easily or get a tool in there. If you are using a string trimmer, just want to give a little PSA. You want to use it properly for optimal results, and also be aware that it is a somewhat dangerous piece of equipment. You want to pay attention to spin direction. You want to work in the direction so that it's thrown away from the clean area, and also trim at a consistent height. In terms of safety considerations, again, they're one of the most dangerous lawn, garden, and landscaping tools. And Some tips and tricks to help minimize risk is, one, check the ground before you trim for loose debris, such as glass, metal, small stones, because that could potentially be picked up and thrown at a high velocity. You want to wear appropriate personal protective equipment. So you see the operator here has ear protection. He's wearing long pants, closed-toed shoes. Ideally, you want to wear long sleeve shirts. He has eye protection on. You don't want to wear anything that's loosely draped or things that could be caught in the spinner head. So no scarves or other hanging garments. You want to be aware of your surroundings. So you ideally stop trimming if people are around and wait until they have passed. And then finally, if you're using a gas-powered string trimmer, make sure that you start it outside because it does put out exhaust, and make sure that you turn off the engine before you start refueling. So in regards to physical and mechanical control, weeds are most easily removed when they are small, shallow rooted, and in moist soil. If the soil is not moist and it's like there's no rain events, you can also wet the soil and start pulling it out. I bet all of you have had an experience of trying to pull out a dandelion when it hasn't rained for a couple of days or a week. It's very difficult, especially if it has a very long taproot. And in terms of tools good for the garden, tons of tools. Example is the Cobra head weeder. That's what I referred to earlier about getting the Cobra head weeder is really good about digging up rhizomes and other underground vegetative structures. It's also good about digging up some taproots and things of such. Dandelion weeder, it's sort of a fork, and you take the weed and put it between the fork and then pry it up. If you've seen a ball dandelion weeder, it has a ball in there so you can get a pivot point and have more leverage. This is a soil knife on the right side. It's also called and sold oftentimes as a hori-hori knife. This tends to have one side that is non-serrated and then one side that is serrated. It's really useful for many reasons. It's useful to cut down weeds, to sort of saw using that serrated side. I've used it sawing down corn, fully mature corn plants. You can dig up weeds with it. You can sort of scrape the surface and knock out some of those very small seedlings. It's a great tool to have. I highly recommend it. Another one of my favorite tools is a scuffle hoe. That is the second one from the right in the diagram at the bottom. It's also called a hula hoe, or a stirrup hoe. It looks sort of like a stirrup, and what you do is you shuffle it or scuffle it along the ground, and it pivots slightly. And what it does is basically skimming the surface about the top centimeter of the surface. So it's, again, very good with those small weeds that are shallow rooted. It's a great way to pull them up and leave them on the soil surface to desiccate. Now, if in your community garden you have larger beds, one thing that I really recommend at least looking at is a wheel hoe. And can be used between rows, in footpaths. It speeds up work quite a bit. And then you can use a scuffle hoe or chopping hoe, whatever type of hoe you want to use between the plants. But in those larger between row areas, a wheel hoe is very useful. I've used it myself, and you can use many different attachments. So here, this wheel hoe has it looks like it's like a wing attachment. You can also use a wheel hoe with the scuffle hoe attachment. Instead of it being about like this, it's much wider, and you can use this to basically scalp that and knock out, pull out weeds and cut weeds in your walkways and in your interrow regions. They're very easy to acquire. Many stores sell them. I recommend them. For optimal use, regardless of your tool, if it's a tool that's sharpened, keep it sharp. It's going to do its best work when it's well maintained. And finally, consistent intervention will eliminate more weed problems. So if you can go out and do your weeding maybe twice a week or once a week, that's going to make your weed pressure much lower than if you weeded right at the beginning of the season and then once at the end of the season. And that will also affect your yield. So we only have a few more slides and then we'll open it up to questions. Next is chemical control. This is probably not really useful for most of the problems, but for some weeds, herbicides might be the best option, especially weeds that pose a threat to human health, such as poison ivy or wild parsnip. I'm going to keep chemical control very brief. If you need to apply, get someone who is certified. New York has a bit stricter rules than upstate New York. Regardless, always read the label instructions before applying an herbicide. Your operator always has to read those label instructions. You should only apply an herbicide to a labeled weed. If the weed is not on the label, then it's an off-label usage. Remember, this label is a law. It is actually a legal document that you're using. So if you applied an herbicide and it damaged your plant, however, you read the label and you see you didn't apply it to the specifications or to the manufacturer's specifications, or you didn't apply to the right plants and you get damaged, they're not on the hook for anything because it was not applied properly. And of course, always wear proper PPE. This information probably isn't as relevant to most of you watching this webinar, but it's good to be aware of these things. And then finally, to just talk about a few uses for weeds. Many garden weeds are edible. So for example, dandelion, common purslane, wood sorrel, that is this right here, and common land quarters, one of the weeds that was shown in the weed ID activity. They are edible. They can be eaten raw. They can be eaten cooked. For example, with dandelion, you can eat the leaves raw, or you can saute them. When my mother was young, she and her siblings would go and pick young dandelion leaves and go and cook and go out on adventures. They used to call them safaris, but it was really in forest, and cook some bacon and then saute their dandelion leaves in the bacon grease. The flowers can be used to make jellies. In dandelion wine, the jellies are sort of floral. Again, the leaves are best when raw. Get best when young. They get a bit bitter when they get big and mature and more fibrous. Common purslane, that is down on the bottom left corner. The leaves are what's eaten, and they can be eaten raw or cooked, and they have a little bit of a mucilaginous texture, but also a mild taste. Wood sorrel, that is on the top right, that's oxalis. The leaves are typically eaten raw. You can put them in salads as accents, and they have a tangy flavor. When I was a little kid, I would go around in our garden because we didn't apply pesticides in the garden I grew up in, and I would find oxalis, and I would pick it, and I would eat a little bit of it, and it would have a sort of lemony, tangy, citrusy flavor. I really enjoyed doing it as a child. And then finally, common land quarters. Again, it's eaten raw, and it has a taste and texture sort of similar to spinach. So you can use it in salads and accents. Again, you don't want to eat any of these if they have been exposed to pesticides. Be very careful, wash them, just to keep things in mind. And of course, common land quarter, you want to get these young leaves because once they get older, they tend to get fibrous and not as yummy. And then going on, you can use weeds for natural dyes. So dandelion, again, you can use the flowers to get soft yellows, but if you dig up the taproot, you can get reds and browns. For wild carrots, you can get using the flowers through these umbels, also called Queen Anne's lace. If you probably see them along roadsides and disturbed sites. You tend to get yellows, golds, and also some greens, depending on how you prepare it. Chicory, that is on the bottom left corner, Sequoium intribus. You see these again along roadsides and disturbed sites. It has these light blue, purple flowers, and you can use the roots. Chicory, if you've ever seen chicory root coffee, It's technically not coffee, but it has a similar taste, bitter taste to coffee. You can also use the roots that for dyes, and you get oranges and browns. And then finally, goldenrods, everyone's probably least favorite plant. You can use the flowers, the blossoms to get yellows and golds. So you're not going to get really blues and purples, but a lot of sort of warm yellows, golds, oranges, browns, using these weeds. So moving on, just a brief recap about this is weed identification and understanding of weed biology is key to effective weed management. There's many weed ID resources available. One of my, it's like the Bible, Weeds of the Northeast. I will also show more of them later. Those are very helpful to identify weeds. You want to tailor your management technique to choice to the weeds you have. Now, of course, it's not like you go into your garden and identify every weed and you think, okay, I got to do this for my purslane and then this for my last quarters and then this, but generally keeping it in the annual, perennial, biennial groups. Do these have vegetative structures? When do these seed? Sort of those bigger categories can be very helpful in terms of the management choices that you use. Many management techniques are available for gardens, small sites, urban farms, community gardens, personal gardens, even like windowsill gardens. And then finally, weeds can be quite useful. They can be quite fun, they can be quite nutritious, and they can be quite nice to look at. Now, here's a link, some examples of further resources in terms of identification manuals for people who are in the Northeast. Weeds of the Northeast is a great reference. This can be found at like online, Barnes and Nobles, but also at local bookstores. I would just give them a call in the reference manuals, and if they don't have it, they can probably order it in for you. If you're outside of the Northeast region, Weeds of the South is a great reference. The images in all of these are beautiful. Weeds of the Midwest and Central Canada, and then finally for Western compatriots, Weeds of California and other Western states. This is a two-part volume if you want to really dive in to weeds found out in the Western part of the US. So thank you so much for your time, and we're gonna open this up for questions. And I just want to thank New York City Parks and GreenThumb for allowing me to come and speak with y'all again. Okay, so I guess I will stop my sharing. Wonderful.
Great, thank you so much. That was so useful. I've learned so much myself. And as we all know, as many gardeners, we're always looking to learn more about plants that we want to grow. And so now you've made it even harder for us as we have to learn about plants that we maybe don't want to grow, but are still fascinated as being partners in the work and a part of the ecosystems that we are part of. So we have a few questions, and people are welcome to add more questions to the chat, but we can work through some of these questions first. So you talked about, making sure not to compost weeds that have gone to seed. Would you recommend composting weeds that haven't gone to seed yet? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so you can, if you pull weeds and they haven't gone to seed yet, of course you can compost those weeds, and just make sure that you, regardless of whatever you're composting, you want to make sure that it's properly composted and reaches proper temperatures. But yes, if it hasn't gone to seed, compost away as long as it's reaching proper temperatures to break down the plant material inside. Thank you, great question.
Yeah, so we have another question for someone who is lucky enough to be maybe near horses. So they have a question about how do you convert a weedy meadow to productive pasture for horses, with some consideration on how you can do that economically?
That is a great question. I would say I'm not as familiar with pasture management myself, but I would think if it's a weedy meadow, you could potentially plant it You could potentially cultivate and then plant it with something, but you might also be able to overseed and fill in those patchy areas. But I can also reach out to a pasture management expert up at Cornell and get back to you with those answers, if that's acceptable to everyone.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's something that seems like a huge interest for this person and always helpful to connect to more resources. This is something that came up with in my breakout group that someone had mentioned. So I was curious. I thought I'd put in as a question. They said that oftentimes what weeds are growing in your space can give you information about your soil, whether it's the nutrition in your soil, whether it may be pH levels. Are there any kind of specific weeds or types of weeds that could be growing that could give you an indication about what's going on in your soil?
Yeah, so this is a very common belief around amongst farmers, growers, gardeners, is that weeds can be sort of like indicators of like, oh, you have, let's say you have what's the word? Let's say you have ragweed, and that you might think, okay, that means I have an excess, or pigweed, for example, I have an excess of nitrogen in your soil. The science is actually a bit sort of murky about that. It's not really reliably an indicator for nutrients. However, some weeds do much better in moist. It can be a bit more helpful in terms of moisture of soil. So some weeds are much more tolerant of moist environments or flooded environments compared to very well drained environments. So in terms of the nitrates, like the soil, like NPK, magnesium, calcium, your base cations, your macronutrients, I would really recommend, if you're curious about those levels, getting a soil test and sending that out to your respective soil testing facility, rather than relying on the weeds that are present in an area as indicator species.
Great. And you touched upon this towards the end of your presentation. I think oftentimes gardeners are looking for ways to make the most of their space. So thinking about cover crops, what are things, can you harvest things from your cover crops, or does it depend on the crop?
Hold on, sorry, I was muted. The goal of cover crops is not really to harvest the cover crop to use elsewhere. However, you can potentially harvest the cover crop and use it for other things. It may not get to the purpose of them as much to sort of add back to the soil, but that is definitely an option. In terms of cover crops, I'm trying to think. Rye might be a good one because they tend to produce quite a bit of biomass. It tends to grow a lot. So that might be a good one to, if you wanted to potentially like cut it down again before it goes to seed and place that down an area, potentially using that as a mulch. If you're doing this in a raised bed, it's not going to produce so much biomass that you could like mulch your whole garden from your 2 raised beds of annual ryegrass. But definitely if your goal is to sort of get something out of your production space, yes, you could do that. You might not get as many of the benefits of cover crops by doing so. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I think, always looking for ways to have things play multiple roles, and make the most of our space.
Yeah.
Great. And then the next question is there a difference between red clover and white clover, which is in a lot of places in New York?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so red clover is Trifolium potens, and white clover is Trifolium repens. I almost forgot that. Ooh, it made me look pretty bad. Otherwise, I would just look in my book. You do see them in multiple different areas. Red clover has pinkish flowers, reddish flowers. White clovers have white flowers. White clover's leaves tend to be bigger, and they have like this cleft. They have like this sort of triangular watermark. I'm pretty sure you can use white clover as a cover crop as well. Yeah, they do. I just looked it up. You can find white clover seed at Hudson Valley Seed Company, Johnny Seed. Both of them can be used as cover crop. A lot of the legumes tend to not establish as quickly as some of the grasses and other broadleaf cover crops. So it might be useful to, it can be very beneficial to your cropping system. Just a heads up, white clover is a perennial though, and but it can act sort of like a living mulch in an area. So if you want to potentially like plant white clover in your walkways, quadrant it off, allow it to get established very well, and then potentially it will be more resistant to people stepping on it, more robust. And it also looks nice and attracts beneficials and pollinators and all those types of things. But you can use white clover as a cover crop.
Great. Yeah, I'm a little preferential to red clover too, just because it's very beautiful. But also interesting to maybe see a mix of them too.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And so another question between two cover crop varieties is what's the difference between hairy vetch and tufted vetch as a cover crop?
Okay, yeah, so I'm not really familiar with tufted vetch as a cover crop. With that said, a lot of times vetch is just sold as vetch, so it's just like Vicia, so it might not be hairy vetch, but I can get back to you with more information on that. I'm not particularly familiar with it, but knowing what I know about hairy vetch and assuming it's similar, I would think it's probably not as hardy as red clover, and again, it's probably more prone to becoming weedy if you do allow it to go to seed.
Great, thank you. So we have someone who's a new gardener. They have a trowel. They're ready to get to work, but they're interested in what weeder would you suggest to remove common milkweed?
Yeah, that's so first thing I would say is where is this common milkweed? Is it in your garden bed, or is it just in like pathways and walkways? Because you may not even want to remove common milkweed. If you common milkweed is I think it's a native to the United States, and also it's a pollinator attractant. Monarch butterflies they nest in common milkweed, and they need that to reproduce. But if it is in your garden bed, it's got to be removed, and you feel like, or wherever it is, and you feel like it needs to be removed, it needs to be removed. It is ultimately your choice. For common milkweed, it depends on if it's big or if it's small. So if it's small, hand pulling will work, a trowel will work, a cobra weeder or something that can sort of like dig in and pull up, that will work. But if it's big, if it's actually like producing seed pods and things of such, I would say probably hand pulling and digging with the trowel, because it will get pretty deeply rooted and it will be hard to pull up. It won't be something where you can just sort of pull up, throw it over your shoulder, do it very easily. So I would get it when it's young, get it when it's small and not as established.
Great. And the last question we have for now, and people can add more to the chat, is how reliable are plant apps like Seek and Picture This? And I think someone also said, iNaturalist, and learning about weeds. And are there any apps that identify weed plants in particular?
I haven't used Picture This. I remember using iNaturalist like once or twice. They can be decent. A good thing is, one thing that I recommend is that if you are not sure, you see a weed and you put it into your Weed ID app and you're like, I'm not really sure what this is. What I recommend is, one, if you have the means to get a reference manual, or you can rent one from your library, or rent one, borrow one from an extension office, or any of those things, I really, 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 it's sort of blurred out, recommend Weeds of the Northeast. It's a great book. They are not paying me. I actually just really love this book. When I was a junior in college, this was like our Bible, and this is the reference book we use. It has a dichotomous tree. It has, like, for your grasses, it has a whole a whole chart of stuff for identifying grasses. And if that's not even working for you, or you just want to talk to a human, for example, I really recommend reaching out to your local extension office. Every county in New York has an extension agency and an extension office, and there's probably someone there who has some background in weed identification. And if they don't, they know someone who does. And probably they will send it off to someone in Cornell, like me, or like Lynn Sosnowski, or a range of people, and Tony DiTomaso, or a range of people who have a lot of weed identification backgrounds, and they will get back to you on, oh, pretty sure, send them a picture, or ideally, if you can, send a few pictures with different angles, and they'll get back to you with an idea of like, what is this weed, so you can go on about your business, you know?
Great. And you talked a little bit earlier about some weeding tools. So someone just wants to know, like what are some of your favorites for, I think, specifically working raised beds?
Okay, I really like clover weeder. Those can be helpful digging out some of those deeper rooted plants and digging out rhizomes. I was first introduced to it I think I was like 19, 20. I think I was 20 years old, and I was like, wow, this is great. A scuffle hoe worked really well in raised beds. Are these smaller raised beds or are these larger raised beds? If Chantal would, she wants to let us know if they're the size. If they are smaller raised beds, scuffle hoes are still pretty good about that, because you can get in, and they have they're also good if you can't bend as well, or if you have gardeners who can't bend as well, because they tend to have long handles, so you can stand upright in scuffle hoe instead of being on your hands and knees, which can be hard for some people, and hand pull. So and they have pretty good, okay, they're large raised beds. Thanks so much. So yeah, so scuffle hoe can work in large raised beds. If it's large raised beds that have a decent amount of space between rows in that interrow area, a wheeled hoe would also be a great idea, because like, let's say you have it's a bed that's 20 feet long, 4 feet wide, or whatever, or 15 feet long, 4 feet wide. You can literally walk along in that interrow, and if you can use a scuffle hoe attachment and get those weeds. They also have mounding attachments. So what it does is, as it goes, it literally like flips the soil to mound around the plants and cover some of those small weeds that are coming up, so you don't have to go around with a scuffle hoe and get around those plants. But even if you don't, they have wings or blades that will also sort of cut. And even if you can't get into that intra-row or within row area between plants, it will also save quite a bit of time if you can get in that between row area, which is a lot of area and a lot of place that before the canopy develops, where weeds can come up with a wheel hoe and then walk along, and then with the scuffle hoe do sort of like close precision work. That saves way more time than getting on your hands and knees with like a trowel or with a dandelion weeder or even a clover weeder. If it's something that has those vegetative structures, you might want to do those patches with a clover weeder, but it's sort of work smart, not hard, but in this case, work smart, so you don't have to work as hard. You're going to have to work hard regardless. Does that answer your question? Cool.
Yeah. So I'll just put them in the chat.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, you don't have to break the bank with these tools. I would say, if I would like, you don't have to spend hundreds of dollars, or these tools, you don't even have to get them new. If you have sometimes they have like reuse stores, and they might have some gardening tools in there. And if it's one where it's like, oh, well, the scuffle hoe hula hoop blade is a bit dull, that can be sharpened up. That can be sharpened up with a file or whatever. You can always refurbish it if price is an issue. Also, if it's a community garden, just having a few of those at the community garden, and not everyone needs their own scuffle hoe or clover weeder, because not everyone's going to be using it all the time. So you can definitely get a good set of tools for a reasonable amount of money. But I would recommend having, like, if I was going to have like my make or break garden tool, weed management tool, I would say like a trowel for planting, a scuffle hoe for weeding. I would actually just get like a hori knife or a soil knife, because that's rather than getting like a dandelion weeder, because the hori knife is multi-use versus a dandelion weeder. It's pretty single use. You can only really like pry things out of the ground, but with a hori knife, you can cut things back, you can scrape at the soil, you can dig tap roots up. So you have many more options. Also, a lot of them have depth guides on there. So you can use that if you're like, oh, I don't have my trowel. You can use that as your trowel and see, okay, I've gone 3 inches down, drop my collard or whatever plant you're planting, and then cover it back up. So I would like get a trowel, a hori knife, and probably like a scuffle hoe. Those would be like my 3 that I would use for probably, and if I had a really big area, a wheel hoe. That will save so much time, and then you can have one person instead of 3 people going around with scuffle hoes. Yeah, that would be like my 3. I'm pretty much golden for the season. And of course, you can customize as you want, but I would start with those 3. Cool.
Great. And so those are all the questions we have. So I'll pass it back to Casey. We'll just need to,
Can you hear me
There.
okay? Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
Now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Aleah. It's so great to learn about the research that you've been doing, and really appreciate you sharing about control methods as well for gardeners. That's so useful. And thanks, Simone, for collecting all the questions and helping to make sure folks' questions are addressed. So yeah, thanks everyone for participating as well.